Now, very few of the British grants would remain. We had the Thomas Clark family here. George Clark became the surveyor for the Spanish, and he has much property here. We have a Maria Mills, who had what was known as a Long Creek grant, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. We had Jesse Fish. He was a real operator. He was the con man of the century, and he lived in St. Augustine. And Jesse Fish would be a book unto himself. He was a land speculator, a con man, and something else. But only a few of the British claims were acknowledged. Now, for instance, I found a British sawmill in 1805 that no one even knows where it is here off Old Kings Road on Mulberry Creek. And there was another sawmill here. In addition to Hewitt's Mill, there was the William Mills Mill, and that's right off of Old Kings Road, and that's the original map of it, and there it is, right there. So much of our history has been forgotten, and Cisco Dean came up with a 1930 map that a Florida engineer did, and he drew in all of these plantations along Old Kings Road and assigned numbers and names to them. And I have this map. And it's a very interesting map because you'll see that these plantations are all built along Old Kings Road. Now, why did they do it along Old Kings Road? Well, because it ran through this swamp. Remember our cattle drive? It ran through the swamp. You had nice black dirt. You had fresh water. You could grow anything in that black dirt. And you had fresh, potable water right next to the ocean. So you had everything going for you. You had transportation, you had good land, you had lots of slaves, and so the plantations pretty much are plunked along Old Kings Road. Now, I wrote a book called The Lost Plantations. It's not a masterpiece, but I tried to trace the owners as best I could. In other words, it's not perfect because the title passed so many times. Mr. Hernandez ended up being one of the largest landowners in the area, and he actually ended up owning over 20,000 acres of land. So he would purchase some of these grants from different people. Long, remember Mrs. Mills? Well, she was on the Long Creek grant. We're going to talk a little more about that. There it is. But it is very confusing because title passed. But this survey map got me going, and I found that in western Flagler, this is out at the Bull Creek Fish Camp, there were immense plantations out there, huge plantations. Those were called donation plantations because we had another sneaky war here. Around 1812, we had what they called the Patriot War, and a bunch of Americans decided to take Florida back from the Spanish, and they started a war coming down here, raping, pillaging, burning, raising merry hell, stirring up the Indians and all sorts of things. But however, these people remained loyal to Spain. They formed a militia, a black militia up in St. Augustine, and this black militia basically shot the pants off of these invading patriots. They really wiped them out. So that was the end of the Patriot War. But these people were given plantations in western Flagler, big ones, in recognition of being loyal to Spain. Isn't that cool? Bet you didn't know that.
That's very interesting.
Okay, there were huge investments in it, monster investments. That's a crushing mill from one of the plantations, and that was used to crush sugarcane. Money, money, money. The DuPonts were probably one of the early families here. They came here in 1791. They owned Malacompra, Abraham DuPont and family. At Malacompra, there was another character called General George Bissou, and boy, was that a story. The slaves in the Caribbean revolted, and they killed hundreds of thousands of white planters. French planters were murdered by the revolting blacks in the Caribbean. Well, the Spanish were all in favor of killing white French. So they made this guy a general, and they gave him a big gold medal. But then, after the revolution was over with, they didn't know what to do with him. So they shipped him to St. Augustine, and they didn't know what to do with him, because he had a little army with him. So they shipped him down to the DuPont plantation at Malacompra here to guard against Indians. And needless to say, once he was down there with his little army, we didn't have any Indians. The Indians all forgot. But all these characters are interesting because this is Hewitt DuPont, who's taking me on a little tour, and the DuPonts still own a plantation just south of Prince's Place, and they have an immense plantation that they own, including the family graveyard and the ruins of the sugar mill. And there I am getting some bugs and chiggers wandering around. And I've written a couple books. I've used the, I'm not going to go into the, you got to buy the damn books. I mean, the story. But anyhow, I was wandering around, and this is on the DuPont plantation, and laying in the grass, I saw this thing. And I said, oh my goodness, I got to photograph that. And this was out in the woods laying there. Later, I found this old postcard of a mule-driven sugar mill, and you see what's right there, the grinder?
Wow.
Yeah, wow. There it is. And my point is this stuff is all over the place here in Flagler County. It's a matter of finding it. It's there. Now, Mr. Hernandez is an example. Hernandez was the son of Martin Hernandez. Martin was came over here and settled New Smyrna. Joseph was his son. He was educated as a lawyer, and he started buying up land. He operated Buena Vista, which is a plantation, Washington Gardens. He operated Malacompra, which is called Bing's Landing. He operated St. Joseph, which was an immense plantation in downtown Palm Coast Parkway. Huge, huge plantation. There were plantations literally all over the place. Now, they had to get their goods to market. And just north, the city of Palm Coast got a grant, and they built a park, and we later found that this was a colonial seaport. This is Longs Creek, which connects up to the river to the north, and they used to flatboat the oranges right here from this park. So it was an early sea shipping port. When they introduced the park, which they built on a grant, they had me as a speaker, and they said, we'd like you to describe the history of this place. You got 10 minutes. So I said, gee, there was a lot of history here. But, so, for instance, when they were building the city of Palm Coast, the St. Joseph plantation was still there, the ruins of the plantation. And this is at Palm Coast Parkway in the downtown Palm Coast. And these were Boy Scouts who did the only survey ever done of that plantation. And this was an immense sugar mill with steam engines, equipment. When the city of Palm Coast was built, they brought in bulldozers, and they bulldozed the whole affair, and the engines still existed. They sold them for scrap. So we don't treasure our history here very much. The Boy Scouts were the only ones that I know of that ever took these photos and did this survey. Never done. This is right downtown Palm Coast. Now, in 1821, Spain had to go, and they'd given out over 932 Florida land grants. These had to be now proven to the U.S. authorities. In other words, you had to prove that you owned the land. Many were not proven. Many were grabbed off by U.S. politicians. Spain left here in 1821 after being here for 37 years. Settlers poured into Florida. This is downtown Palm Coast. And people just, settlers, land people came pouring in. This is when Bulow showed up. Bulow didn't turn up until 1821, which in his historical terms is like a week ago. One of the things that Beulah built was this immense sugar mill. There's the steam engine house where they had the right low pressure steam engine. There's the conveyor belt that would bring sugar up to the top. The crushing mill was up here. Remember you saw that picture of the sugar works? It was right there. These were the heated cauldrons, copper kettles for making sugar. This was the purgatory they call, where they would put the crystallized sugar in barrels and let it sit. This was the shipping department. They would ship. They had everything then that we have in modern industry. These were big-time commercial operations. Now, there was also, I had a little fun with this, there's an Indian princess, I think there. This is courtesy of Bill Lenson. Bill Lenson is a Beulah. His family inherited much of the Beulah land. They owned the loop. They owned much of the land along John Anderson. He came up with this picture of Emily Bucknor Beulah, who was a baby fathered by Beulah Sr. She's an Indian baby. She doesn't look like an Indian, because this would be her grandfather, which was King Philip, who was the head of the Miccosukee tribe, or the Atlantic Seminole Indians. And her father would have been Charles Wilhelm Beulah, Sr. She had Emily. Cameras didn't exist, but Emily had a baby, Elizabeth. And I found this amazing resemblance of Elizabeth with her grandfather. And quizzing Bill Lenson, he said, yeah. He said, it's been a family history hidden because Emily later married Dr. Buckner in New York, who was the head of the New York Stock Exchange. She later became one of the most wealthy, prominent women in America, Emily Beulah Buckner. And they ran the New York Stock Exchange. And so they didn't want anyone to know that she was an Indian baby fathered by Charles Wilhelm. But this is the Beulah family history. Do you find this in writing? You would if you bought my book. Anyway, I did an electronic construction of what the Beulah Plantation house looked like. I did this on PowerPoint, rather on, what do you call it? You know, the one, I can't remember. But anyway, I drew that and put that, plunked it in there. When the Army arrived to take over Beulah, they built a fort in front. And this was a log fort. And they took all of Beulah's cotton and built a barricade around the house. And then they built a wooden fort in front of Beulah. And that's where the kitchen area was. And that boat ramp is still there, by the way, at Beulah. It still exists. So there were many Indian things going on. You had the Indian Removal Act. Remember I said 1820? And this was a good, real piece of work. His name was Andrew Jackson. He was President of the United States. And he said, we're going to remove all Indians from the United States. And in the same vein, we're going to pass some really cool laws that there's no such thing as a free black in America. Every black person must have an owner. And our Congress voted laws saying that there were no more free blacks. Remember that under Spanish, there were free blacks, because blacks had been escaping into Florida for hundreds of years. And they'd been living with the Indians. In some cases, they were related to the Indians. They intermarried. So all of a sudden, 1821, Bluey had hit the fan. He said, everybody of dark skin has to have an owner. Number two, they cannot own property. I'm sure you've heard about the Trail of Tears and what happened when they started to remove people of color from the United States and send them out to Texas. It didn't go that well. Florida's main industry was slave raiding. You had large groups of men coming down from Georgia, the Carolinas, finding these little black